everyone. I'm Noah Beit-Aharon, a first-time town meeting representative from Precinct 6. I asked on Facebook a little while ago whether it would be useful to people for me to try and record my impressions and experiences from town meeting as a first-timer, and now I'm bringing those to SMAC so that people who aren't on Facebook can get the same information and have the same opportunities to learn a little bit about how town meeting functions, or to explain what I'm misunderstanding about things. Here's what I wrote about our first week of town meeting. For the most part, the town meeting experience has been almost exactly what I imagined it to be. That is, a tedious mess of procedural rules and rules lawyering, technical questions that are really more of a comment, 3.5-hour sessions during which barely any town business actually gets done, and thanks to procedural motions and nonsense. And times when I'm glad and even proud to be involved, when the tedium gets punctuated by moving statements and decisive actions, and when you really do feel like your presence makes a difference. My impression of the moderators so far is that Deputy Moderator Carmel Drews is better at moderating than Town Moderator Bob Mullen, who sometimes gives me the impression of flying by the seat of his pants. For example, at some point on Monday, there was a reading of the Financial Committee's report and recommendations for the town budget, and people were allowed to call out hold if they wanted to discuss line items later on. Partway through this process, Mullen announced that only those who personally called hold would be allowed to ask questions about those items. This was a terrible idea because it would encourage people to shout hold about every single line just to reserve the right to ask a question if they thought of one later. It would also require him to write down the name of every single person who called hold every single time, which would slow the whole process to a crawl. It was also unfair to suggest such a rule after part of the committee's report had already been read and gone by. Thankfully, after some uproar, Mullen walked back this new rule and said he would allow relevant questions by anyone on the held items. I know in theory this sounds like it would take more time, but in practice it wastes far less. Speaking of wasting time, on Wednesday the majority of those holds turned out to be from a few members of the Financial Committee, plus a friend or two, who were unhappy that the overall committee had voted down their proposals for budget cuts to various town departments, and who wanted to bring each and every one of those failed committee votes up for a vote at the town meeting level. They spent over an hour of our time on Wednesday bringing forth amendments to reduce department budgets by the exact amounts they had suggested at the FinCom level, demanding time for technical questions and pro and con debate on each. It was ludicrous, and each of their first 3 amendments failed by more than 2-1. Nonetheless, they were all set to waste countless more hours, as if to punish the rest of us for something, until Ed Quigley proposed combining the entire remaining minority report of amendments into a single item and voting them up or down together as a package deal. It took another 15 minutes to actually get to that vote, thanks to objections and technical questions and whining disguised as technical questions, and it felt like much longer, so in my original summary on Facebook, I overestimated and said it took half an hour. But after that, town meeting voted overwhelmingly against the budget cuts and allowed us to head home just past 10:30 p.m. Our first item on Wednesday night was far more meaningful than all these time-wasting motions. It was an amendment to the town bylaws that would establish the Stoughton Equal Opportunity Committee, or SEOC, as a permanent 9-member advisory committee to help the school committee and town manager meet our diverse town's diverse needs in an appropriate way. As a volunteer advisory committee, the SEOC will have no budget, but will help the town manager make informed decisions about how to allocate the part of his budget designated for things like translation services, event planning, and so on. It is, in my opinion, a very unobjectionable committee to have, and our town manager, superintendent, and school committee all wholeheartedly supported the amendment. But because some people believe everything about the supposed evils of diversity, equity, and inclusion that they see on TV, yes, I'm talking about the dreaded DEI that used to be called civil rights and remains unpopular in some quarters to this day, we had to spend a tremendous amount of time on presentations, points of information, points of order, technical questions, including some that were questions in name only, and pro and con debate before we could actually vote on the bylaw change, which passed by a nearly 2-1 margin, 87-46. Early on, I was particularly disappointed to hear Select Board member Scott Carrara claim that the members of the Select Board had not had sufficient time to review the materials and could not recommend the amendment sight unseen. Not only had the amendment's text, and even a word-by-word comparison of the text to an earlier draft of the text, been sent to all members by email ahead of the meeting, but at the fall Select Board meeting, now Vice Chair Deborah Roberts had sought to introduce the amendment and been told that she could not bring the question before the Select Board until it had gone through town meeting first. It's a remarkably unfair catch-22 to insist that no matter where you bring your proposal, it has to be brought up somewhere else first. I spoke up to point out this unfair dynamic. But as LeVar Burton used to say on Reading Rainbow, don't take my word for it. I'm just one first-time rep who got involved over the school issue and decided to stay engaged, and you don't have to take my word for these things. All these meetings are recorded on SMAC, and you can review the footage for yourself. If you watch the SMAC footage from night 2 of town meeting, the presentation on the amendment begins around minute 22:50, Scott Carrara's comments start around minute 39 and 15 seconds, and my response follows at minute 43 and 15. For my favorite moment of the night, though, you'll have to skip to minute 59:45 and watch for about 45 seconds. I won't spoil the fun, but a pointed question against the amendment received the perfect answer. Here's my summary of town meeting on 5/12/2025, night 3 of the town meeting. Monday was a much smoother and more productive town meeting than either day of last week, and in comparison, it felt like we were really speeding through articles. 2 representatives, Juan Fox and Dave Lurie, dropped nearly all of their holds on budget line items, allowing us to move forward and get to actual votes much faster. The one hold Dave kept was his hold on the education budget, where he moved to cut it by $1.5 million. There was a bit of a kerfuffle because he made this motion without asking any questions first, and despite the deputy moderator having very clearly explained the procedure for questions and motions just a few minutes before, he then tried to take time for questions on the budget before explaining his motion. Carmel did not allow this, so Dave took most of his 2 minutes of explanation time telling us what his question would have been, whether we should reserve $1.5 million from the education budget just in case the state of Massachusetts lost a federal lawsuit. Dr. Baeta explained that the lawsuit was about whether the Trump administration could claw back funding that the federal government had already approved for upgrading school HVAC systems. The $1.5 million we are using to upgrade the Gibbon School's HVAC comes from these funds, not from our town's budget at all. The state has apparently told us to proceed with the project, and my understanding of the situation is that even if Massachusetts were to lose the lawsuit after work was completed, this would mean the feds were leaving their bills unpaid, not the town of Stoughton's. So it made no sense to suggest reducing our education budget by $1.5 million, no matter what happened with the lawsuit. In any case, the body voted down Dave's amendment to the education budget, and the meeting continued apace. While the previously mentioned exchange happened during a brief period when Bob Mullen had recused himself from the proceedings, it would be unfair of me not to note that I was much happier with Bob Mullen's moderation on Monday than I had been previously. He did a good job keeping the meeting running, shut down attempts to bring non-budgetary amendments to the floor without the requisite 48-hour submission period, and when nobody was standing at the microphones, he was quick to say, "Technical questions? Seeing none, it's time for pro and con debate. Seeing none, let's proceed to the vote." Having seen how last week went, I cannot stress enough how much time and unnecessary nonsense this saved us all. My main complaint with him on Monday was on an article where he opened the floor to pro and con debate, and the first person in line was Cynthia Walsh, who is an absolute treasure for how much time she saves us all. Cynthia moved the previous question, which is a procedural motion that says we should cut off all further debate on a subject and just vote on it already. It takes a 2/3 majority to succeed in cutting off debate like that. It's the local equivalent of cloture if you're familiar with the U.S. Senate procedure. And the way it's supposed to work is that once someone moves the question, you vote on that motion right away without further debate unless the motion fails. Bob refused to follow this procedure because Lisa Lyons was at the other microphone and Carolyn Campbell was at a third, and he wanted there to be a pro and con debate. It should be noted that Lisa had already asked 2 technical questions that were barely questions, in which she had absolutely made her perspective known already. She nonetheless got 2 minutes to speak against the article, after which Bob asked Carolyn to speak in its favor. Carolyn said she was only up there to move the question herself, so Bob had to relent and let the pro and con debate end there. The article was passed 128-9. It struck me as ridiculous to have insisted that we spend extra time on an article that had such lopsided support. There was a pretty lengthy exchange between Bob and a town meeting rep I don't know, who was yelling at him for not following procedure properly, I think possibly on that same motion of Cynthia's to move the question and end debate. Both of them behave very inappropriately, in my opinion, but it's the moderator's job to address concerns calmly and move the meeting along, not make repeated jabs at a member of the body and keep suggesting that he step outside, presumably to calm himself, though people joked that Bob was suggesting they fight. I've since heard that at past meetings, Bob did sometimes ask reps to go to the cafeteria outside for a few minutes when things got heated and they ignored his rulings on procedure. Now a confession of my own failures. Thanks to my own misreading of one of the articles, I failed to ask a relevant question that I think I should have. There was an article on purchasing police equipment, including 4 new cruisers, and the way it was written, I thought we were getting 3 of these cruisers for an absolute steal of some $60,000. If they'd been a more significant expense, I would have wanted to know how old the current fleet is and why new cruisers were really needed, but I figured the price was right and I shouldn't make a big fuss the way people had over the fire department saving up for a new ladder truck. It was an error in how I was reading the article, though. The new cruisers are about $60,000 each. Under these circumstances, I think it was my duty to do due diligence and make sure we're not spending money on replacing well-kept 5-year-old vehicles or something. Considering the hell people gave the fire chief over wanting to replace a ladder truck that is only a year younger than I am, purchased in 1988, I think it's only fair that we make sure our purchases for the police department are for needs and not just wants. Overall, though, I was both impressed and relieved at how efficiently Monday went and how many articles we were able to get through without protracted debate. Healthy debate on important issues is good to have, but much of last week felt like the opposite of healthy debate, just a mean-spirited wasting of time to punish the rest of town meeting for something or other. Hopefully tonight's meeting will be as productive as Monday's.